Welcome everyone to this CalHFA board workshop. I know we're lucky to have some of our board members with us, right? Thank you for coming. And then, of course, coming back, all of you remember Tony Sertich, who used to be here and now is with the Debt Limitation Allocation Committee. Welcome, Tony. Good to have you back in the house. Feels like old shoes, right? Awesome. Okay, I know Tia's coming, and we should have one more coming, but why don't we get started? You know, at this very moment when California is reaching its private activity bond volume cap, this discussion about bond recycling couldn't be more timely. Given the new reality of volume cap scarcity, it's our responsibility in the state of California to make sure that we are using this limited resource efficiently and maximizing the amount of housing units we create with every bond dollar. Few tools that are at our disposal are as innovative and as helpful to this discussion than recycling private activity bonds. Although Congress authorized states to do this in 2008, only New York, Massachusetts, Washington, and Colorado have set up bond recycling programs. So given this new reality in California, we should take a hard look at this option. So first I want to thank Richard and Tinru, thank you for coming here from New York. Almost just like the Big Apple now that the stadium's over there, right? You can see that. I know how this happened because the New York Housing Development Corp and some guy on our team used to be out there. But Rich, I know you're in the forefront of getting those 2008 authority to recycle that was passed in Congress and have set up the nation's first and most successful recycling program. So we're really fortunate to have you and then look forward to both of your discussions here. And Frances, thank you for setting this up because I can see your handiwork all throughout this. So like I like to say, it's not a monologue. It's not a dialogue. It's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. I had it, I'll get it. So as you see questions, I'm telling folks to ask questions right away and let's educate everyone. So with that, Richard, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. If there are questions, I think in order for the live streaming to work, people have to use that microphone, but that would be great. And you can, if you want to, you can totally interrupt. It is all good. Well, we're glad to be here. Yes, Francesca and we have a relationship. We've known each other a while, and he's a great addition to your team here, and so that's really helpful. But the relationship between California and New York is a good, strong one, and we're proud of some of the things that we've done. And partly, this is a discussion about how do you respond to scarcity, and how do you create more tools, and that was the origin of this. And as you deal with your housing issues and the crisis that exists in California, this is an additional tool that we hope other people will use. The more people that use things, then the better things are generally. And housing is a challenge. And we all work well together because it's not a competition. Whatever you do here is additive to the communities in the state and makes California a better place. And it's not, like that means it's a disadvantage. So we always like to share our best practices, and this is just one example of that. So the presentation is sort of set up to focus on recycling and a little bit about some other efficiency tools. There's a little bit of background on HDC, and then we focus on recycling, and then a little bit, our newest thing is dealing with public housing, and then I know that that's a challenge throughout the state as well here. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing with respect to that and how recycling plays a role for that. My colleague, Tinru Lin, is here as well, and she'll fill in on some of the details. She definitely helped me in putting together this presentation, but also is a member of our capital markets team and is a great proponent as well. So, and now Tia is in the house. Excellent.
Can I get you to hang on one second?
Yeah.
Just before we go, Melinda, Grant, sit down. You're over there. And Tia Boatman Patterson. I wanted to make sure we acknowledge our state agency and our executive director. So with that, Richard, you're on. Hey, he's talking, so let's listen.
Yes, sir.
No worries. So, a little bit of background. So, HDC is a local housing finance agency. We happen to be the largest one, not surprisingly, because New York City is the largest city in the country. We were established almost 50 years ago now under state law. And we have a board as well. Three of the members of our board are members of the mayor's cabinet. The chairperson is the housing commissioner for the city, and then the budget director and the finance director are members. And the governor appoints two members, and the mayor appoints the other two. So effectively, we're controlled by the city, but we are state created. We have a staff of 180. We have over actually $22 billion in total assets. We've become quite large, and over 200,000 units of housing that have been financed and that are currently regulated by HDC. And so we are in and out one of the largest issuers of housing. Obviously, we are only focused on multifamily. It makes us very different than the CalHFA in that you have a significant single-family component. We are just a multifamily issuer. The state has its own single-family issuer as well as the state HFA. Our authority overlaps with the state HFA in New York City alone. They have statewide authority. We have authority limited to the 5 beautiful boroughs of New York City. And so we have a strong credit rating, and we have our own mortgage insurer. And that's a different aspect of HDC. We have that as well. And so that's sort of the baseline, a little bit of understanding. The rules of private activity funds are maybe not always clear to everyone who's not involved in it, but there are certain things as far as low income that needs to be a part of it. And this plays a role in recycling as well, in that you need to have the minimum of affordability for recycling. So it has to have at least 20% of the units allocated to people whose are 50% of the area median income, or 40% at 60% of the area median income. So it still has an affordable component for recycling. And so just wanted to remind people, and so that's sort of the baseline for what our private activity. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the programs we have and pictures? Always good to have pictures in a presentation.
Yes, and these beautiful pictures kind of each representing one of our different financing programs. And before Rich really get into the nitty-gritty of the recycling, how we apply the recycling application to our program, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what type of financing program we provide. So in New York, we provide a low-income program to the mixed income program. Including here, we show the ELA program standing for the very low and the low income program, usually gearing toward the household at and below 60% of AMI. And then on the right side, you have, and at the bottom, you also have two different types of the mixed income program. It's really trying to broaden up the income tiers to cross to the workforce type of middle and moderate income household, in addition to allow still a component set aside for the low income component. So actually, because of being a really high cost city, we do need to cover a really large income spectrum, and this will later play on how the recycle program will actually provide an opportunity for us to really channel the most valuable volume cap to low income while using the recycle to more like a mixed income program. Going to the next slide, this talks about how we monetize our subsidy loan. And for making housing financing feasible in New York, usually you will need to allocate the volume cap and together with the tax-exempt financing. And in addition, both New York City and the HDC put in a fair amount of subsidy. And this is here since 2003, HDC has provided close to 3 billion of subsidy loans in the form of 1% interest-only loan to bring down the overall funding costs. But these are still the hard pay loans, so really allow us to later on monetize and through the issuance of first taxable bonds, and later on, once we have the recycle program, through the issuance of tax-exempt bond to replenish our corporate reserve to keep the engine going. So we make subsidy loan and monetizing them, and then replenish our reserve to continue put the money into the program.
The subsidy loans are actually coming from HDC's own profit. So as a housing finance agency, we're allowed to make certain revenues, and we've been particularly successful. So the subsidy that we put in actually comes from HDC's profit. That is partnered with the the city's money that is out of its capital budget. And that is additional money and subsidy that's put into a lot of the transactions that we do. So we work hand in hand with the city's subsidy, but this is part of our own reserves and our own money that then we monetize. And being able to use recycling meant that we were able to lower the cost of our borrowing for these particular loans. So that was part of an additional sort of trick that we learned over time, and that we can share, obviously, with other folks to sort of see how we did that. I'm going to, you want to switch back? Want to make sure that we're in vision. So part of the thing that we're facing, and I know that this is an increasing issue for you in California, is the competition for volume cap. So it's become a scarcer resource. For us, it became scarce a long time ago, and that led to why we asked for the creation of recycling, and why we tried also, and we're going to talk a little bit about our bifurcated model as an additional tool. And that was part of this dynamic, is we didn't have enough volume cap to do everything that we wanted to do in New York State, and that the city itself was getting a sub-allocation, and then HDC would get an additional allocation from the state. And there's this balancing that goes on. And you know, housing in the end is a local product. And you go through a process as well, and you have your separate allocating agency that goes through that process. But there's this dynamic of how do you kind of pick which projects get done, and where they are done, and where is the demand, and the like. And that has led to sort of some of the challenges that we face, and then some of the solutions that we've come up with. And like one of the issues that comes up, and as I said, we'll talk about it in the context of focusing volume cap on the low income component of projects, where they can get the tax credits. And that is sort of an efficiency model. And then how do you meet what we call the 50% test, which is an underlying rule that is sort of very important to the allocation of volume cap. That is that you want to make sure that you will qualify for low-income housing tax credits, and so you focus a certain amount of the volume cap on the low-income component of a transaction. And you don't necessarily provide volume cap for the upper income parts of the project, but you can use recycling, and that's another little trick, and we're going to go over it for you as well to give you an idea about how we've done that. So the point that there are two aspects to the tax exempt bonds. One is a cost of capital. That is, when you issue bonds, you can borrow at a lower rate than when you do taxable bonds, and so there's an advantage to tax exemption. The other part, which is sort of self-evident, is the tax credit. So important to all of affordable housing because it provides a very, very significant subsidy for those low-income units. Sometimes as much as 40% of the development cost for that low-income unit can be covered by the sale of those tax credits. So super important that we figure out a way to kind of focus that. And so that's part of the dynamic that goes on. And then the difference between tax exempt and taxable changes over time. Shortly after the financial crisis, there was a big difference, then not a big difference, and now there is a fair amount of a differential. Even though rates as a whole are very low, there is a difference between a tax exempt rate and a taxable rate. And so there's an advantage to doing tax exemption. And that's the part of recycling that's important. which is that it allows you to capture tax-exempt cost of capital. And that is important because anything that you can do to reduce the cost of borrowing means that you can do more housing, pure and simple, because it reduces the costs that are related to the project.
I'm sorry, Richard, can you back up on that? So why is recycling equal to tax exempt?
Well, recycling is basically allows you to do tax exemption. So that's the point of it. So what and I'm going to go into sort of the basic background of recycling the next slide actually. But yes, so the a part about recycling is that it means that you can do tax exemption. So that is the point. And otherwise you would be doing taxable bonds. So the background, so the point of this was we were facing this issue, and the next slide after this will kind of go through an example. A lot of projects that are new construction pay down the amount of bonds that are being used because the project can't support as much debt as is necessary to satisfy that 50% test. So an underlying point, remember, is in order to qualify for tax credits, 50% of the total development cost for the project needs to be financed with bonds. So a project maybe is going to cost $50 million. So at least half, say $25 million, needs to be tax-exempt bonds. But the project only supports $10 million. It's because the rents are so low that it can't support all that debt. So you need to issue $25 million up front, and the project is going to pay down through a variety of different sources, but mostly from the sale of tax credits, from $25 million down to $10 million. It used to be that those bonds would just go away, and then you just lost the value of that. What we did was, by appealing to Congress and having some good timing and a little bit of luck, we were able to get them to approve the concept of recycling. And that meant that we could then reuse that. And I'm going to go through a little bit of the basic rules behind that. But so this was enacted into federal law back in 2008. You might remember 2008, it was a bad year. That was when the markets almost collapsed. A lot of problems happened. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were in significant distress. Congress enacted the Housing Economic Recovery Act. And in that process of Congress setting up the receivership for Fannie and Freddie, there was housing opportunity, and a couple of things got passed as part of that. And one of those things was recycling. So we got in and we did that. And this is just an example of the kind of scope and how we look at this, is that it's had a significant advantage for us in that we've done billions of dollars of recycling, impacted thousands of units, and financed a lot of projects. The other thing is a dynamic, and this is going to be, I think, more important in California, because in New York, the two big issuers of housing are the state HFA and HDC. We don't have a lot of local issuance. And so it's a different dynamic that you have in the state here, in that there are a lot of different issuers. So we have figured out a coordination between the state and the city. That's been very important for us and has allowed us to be able to send recycling when we had too much and they needed it. And they have been able to send to us now that we have a really big program with our Public Housing Authority. And I'll go into that near the end of the presentation. So, but that dynamic of that sharing and that cooperation is very important, and would be very important for an effective program in California as well. That sort of ability to communicate and share and then figure out a pipeline of what you're going to be using it for, because that's the other part of this that matters. This is just an example of sort of what we were trying to describe of how recycling would work, and that the prepayment occurs, the bonds and the shift in when the tax credits come in kind of shows the moving of how things work, and it's just an example to show that. And when we were appealing for this, we described it as a penalty. It was sort of saying, this penalizes multifamily. Because in single family, when prepayments occur, and they often do in single family, there is permission to recycle the prepayment and use for another loan. It wasn't allowed in multifamily until 2008. So we argued that we were being penalized, and that was part of the dynamic that then allowed us to get it enacted. So the baseline rules, is that the refunding has to occur, that is, the recycling occurs within 4 years of the initial issuance of debt. So it allows for a construction period. A lot of projects take a period of time to be built. So this allows for that to happen, but there's a sort of a point in time where you need to be able to either use the prepayment or not. So for projects that are particularly difficult and complicated that might not be completed and the prepayment might not occur in 4 years, that's a disincentive, and that's something to think about. It requires that the new loan be to an eligible project within 6 months after the effective date of the prepayment. So this is another time frame. It's super tight, and we've been arguing for a longer period of time, but that's one of the challenges that's sort of built into the original statute. By the way, we had asked for a year, but you don't always get what you want, and so it got reduced to 6 months. And then the bonds themselves can only go out for a total of 34 years. So what this means is that a project originally funded in 2010 that was going to be, and then got recycled in 2013, that the bonds on that recycled project can't go out further than 2044. So it's 34 years from the initial issuance. It's not a big problem. It means most projects, a 30-year mortgage is perfectly satisfactory. But it's just one of those things. There are time frames that you need to take into consideration when you use recycling. An important point is recycled bonds do not come with low-income housing tax credits. So that's one of the other dynamics. It's not a double dip, and the IRS is super careful about that and is super concerned about that. It would make the program be a lot more expensive if it did. And so that was part of the way that we sold it, was to say that you don't get another dip at low-income housing tax credits. But as I said earlier, the new project needs to follow the tax-exempt bond rules. So it's still a low-income project, or at least a portion of it has a low-income component. The benefits, obviously, is that where there's scarcity of volume cap, and as you're sort of now facing here in California, and where it's been going on in some other places for a while, it gives you additional finance capacity. It allows issuers to prioritize new money volume cap on multifamily housing. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other changes that we're trying to get implemented by Congress that a bunch of the states are supporting in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. It does encourage more affordability in mixed income projects because they still need to satisfy the normal tax-exempt bond rules of affordability to qualify. It obviously allows for a more efficient use of volume cap for those 80-20 projects because you don't need to focus more than, if you're going to finance a larger percentage of the project, you can use recycling for that percentage of the project. And so that's an important thing. Once again, it's efficiency that is an important aspect of this. And then there's the bifurcated structures, which I'm going to explain in a minute. The limits are obviously the supply is limited because only HFAs that issue a great deal of private activity bonds with tax credits with large prepayments are available for recycling. Demand is limited because most multifamily housing requires significant subsidies and thus need the LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit. We're a bit unusual, and maybe now so are you, in that we have affordable housing needs across income spectrums, and so we subsidize housing at non-tax credit levels. And so that kind of workforce housing in some of your more expensive cities, that's something where this can be an efficient tool to address that. And that's a different dynamic. In many other states, to be honest with you, there aren't many apartments being rented for people at 100% of the AMI. Those people are buying a home. Obviously, in California, with your really high costs, that's less of an issue. I mean, that's a different dynamic, and that's part of what this helps address. It's particularly effective for mixed income housing finance. The challenges I've already described, but this is just sort of a listing of that. It's a timing issue. There's the original debt must be refunded before the original bonds are redeemed. It's a lot of timing stuff. This is rather legal. Some of my slideshows are, I actually am a lawyer by training, although I'm now the chief operating officer at HDC. But some of my slides are kind of go into that nitty gritty, and that may be too much, but it's helpful, I hope, for the board members to understand that, but I don't necessarily need to dig in as much. But there are these timing aspects to things, and making sure that you do it right is super important. And so that's partly what we try to do in explaining that. And obviously the HFA will use its own counsel and make sure that it follows the rules closely. So as I mentioned earlier, the proposed changes for recycling in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, one of the really great things that, there's this desire to increase housing tax credits more broadly. And there are other improvements, including something called locking the 4% at 4, which would increase the amount of funds raised by tax credits. So there's a lot of great things in there. We got some special things put in relating to recycling. And the most important one is that allowing for recycling to be used from multifamily into single family. As I mentioned earlier, private activity bonds are limited by the federal government, and so there's only so much that you get, and that's sort of the whole scarcity that we started with. A certain amount gets used for single family, and single family is not as efficient to use as multifamily because it doesn't come with that LIHTC, the credit. So what this does is sort of say, hey, we'll use recycling from multifamily and then use it on single family. So that's an important added benefit. There are other provisions in there that address some of the things that I've described earlier as being part of the problem. The 6-month rule, we would expand it to 12 months. Issues as far as what's considered a refunding. Super technical points that, if they were done, would make it a more flexible tool. And the more flexible it is, the more likely it'll get used efficiently. So that's the other part that's an important thing, and part of the advocacy as we try to get some of that improved. And obviously, with Tia chairing the NCSHA, that's helpful as far as we try to focus as much attention on the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act as possible to see if we can get that passed through Congress. So I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of how we've used recycling. So we've used it in preservation transactions, and we've used it in new construction transactions, and we've used it in mixed income. And I'm going to walk through the different examples. In a preservation deal, part of the issue for us is we have a lot more demand for the volume cap than we have projects that we can actually that we have volume cap to use. We just don't have enough. So we've focused a lot of our energies away from using new money cap on preservation deals. And what we have done, though, is try to reduce the cost of capital by using recycling. So this is just one example of a project. This goes back a little while, but a mixed income project. It had low-income people there, and the rents were set relatively low. But it wasn't an efficient use of volume cap for this transaction, and so we used recycled bonds. And so it's just an example of that. Once again, preserving the affordability and making sure that work was done that significantly improved the quality of life for the residents, but it was a more efficient, I keep on using that term efficient, but for us, we were able to accomplish our goals without using new money volume cap on the transaction. This is another project. This is a before and after. There's nothing like a good lot that has garbage on it to sort of say before, and then look, beautiful new development after. The before is this sort of, we don't, New York, your image of it is probably everything is built out. We have parking lots and we have other things and we have, lots with garbage and stuff like that. It is a significantly built out environment, but there are opportunities, and this was one, a relatively large one. And this got financed during the financial crisis, and this was, a new construction transaction, and it was mixed income in the South Bronx. And this is an area where a lot of the incomes are quite low, and so it was important to be able to do a mix of incomes. It's a concentration of poverty question, and it's really trying to address different needs in a community. And part of this was going to have a moderate income component, where most of the units were going to be targeted to people at 80% AMI, and that only a few were going to be targeted at 50% or 60% AMI. And that was an example. So this was the first new construction deal to use recycled bonds, and that was we called it REHOP. It was we had a lot of different kinds of names, but it was really kind of an interesting point. It had a lot of subsidy in the transaction, and here is a very simplified sources and uses for this project. What's interesting, and anyone in California will greatly appreciate this, is look at what the cost was back then. The total use was 400,000 a unit. If you could get that done in California, you would be going, yay! And I understand that. This actually had a relatively high acquisition cost, because even though it was garbage strewn, it was in the Bronx, and it had some value, and so that was a $40 per square foot cost of land. Mind you, in Manhattan, costs of land now range from $700 to $1,000 a square foot. So this was cheap, and it still is cheap. But this sort of shows you, though, the overall costs. And the point was that this deal required a lot of subsidy. All our deals do, because of the incomes that we're serving. This is in a neighborhood that if you did not provide subsidy, nothing would get built, because the cost of building is so high compared to what the market rents are. So this is both an economic development tool as a housing tool in that case. So this deal also required a lot of equity. This was during the financial crisis, and these people were in deep on that land price, and so they were willing to put in 20% equity, which is extraordinarily high for affordable housing. By the way, this project is working incredibly well. It really was, going back, it's attractive, but it also, it really does serve a mix of incomes in a neighborhood, and so a real success story, and one that we're all super proud of, and it worked. But it was during a time when not everything did, and it was a hard time, but it was a project we can really be proud of. So I mentioned before bifurcation, so I want to go into this, and this is going to get a little bit complicated, but once again, I think the slides are pretty informative and they're helpful. So if I'm going through it too quickly, one, you can ask a question, but two, you also can go back and look at the slides. The major point about bifurcation is that we have low-income units that we're going to focus the tax exempt bonds on, the new money volume cap, and we're going to focus the LIHTC on. It's important to remember, and this structure was started before we had income averaging, but the units that used to be below 60%, above 60% AMI, targeting people of moderate and middle incomes, were not going to qualify for tax credits. So our point is, let's not use bonds on those units. We're only going to use bonds on the low-income units that will qualify for tax credits. So that is the basic concept here. And we're using a condominium structure, where we're basically having different units that are a low-income unit and a middle-income unit, or in some cases, a lot of different units. But basically, and when we say a unit, we're talking about all of the units targeting that particular population, that income range. So in this concept, you could have what we call an 80-20. Remember, the baseline requirement for affordable housing in order to be eligible for bonds is that 20% of the units are targeted to people at 50% of the area median income. So you can finance that whole project with tax-exempt bonds. And what we're saying is, let's focus just on that low-income component. And by doing that, we greatly reduce the amount of volume cap needed for a mixed income project. So if a project is going to cost $100 million, in order to qualify for tax credits, 50% rule, $50 million needs to be bonds. Well, if only 20% is low income and we want to target just to the low income component, we can give that divide that building into two. There's the 80% that's above and the 20% that's low income. Now our 50% test is focused just on that low income component. So instead of giving it 50 million in tax exempt bonds, we can give it 10 million. And that allows us, and they still get the same amount of credits for the units that they would otherwise get. It just allows us to sort of, and allows us to focus the volume cap on the low income. So this was a real breakthrough because you do want to support mixed income housing. It's an important part of the overall landscape. But by doing this bifurcation, once again, you could be very efficient. And then recycling plays a role in this, and I'll get to that in some of the examples. Because you can do the low income component with private activity bonds, and then the rest, not all of the rest, but a portion of the rest with recycled bonds. And so that's sort of kind of the additional point that's kind of cool. And I'll try to go into that. Cool if you're wonky like me. I have to recognize who I am. But that's besides the point. I'm sorry, okay. So the focus, as I said, is on the low-income unit. There are these other rules that are available relating to mixed income that called deep rent skewing. It's tax stuff, and the part of this bifurcated model is that you don't have to worry about it. I'm not going to explain it. It's too complicated. But it's a tax part that gets done in mixed income projects, and that matters. Because there's this idea of next available unit and when people go over income. It's not really relevant for this, but it is something that this approach makes easier, and that's always good. Easier is better. And then the low-income condo is considered a low-income building for purposes. So it's once again, it's a tax rule and the point. And the projects here are often very much focused on a real property tax exemption. And that sort of, it allows them to still get that. And that's sort of one of the focuses. That's a rather specific New York approach, but it is important. And sometimes you need to have low-income units in order to satisfy other requirements, and this allows you to still do that and not turn that away. All right. Okay. The other thing is that the investors on the tax credit side like the bifurcated structure. There's more risk in market rate units. Low-income units are relatively easy to rent. There's enormous demand for low-income units. Market rate, by its definition, is dependent on a market. And so sometimes if there's risk there, the investor doesn't want that risk. On the flip side, the developer doesn't want to share the revenue from that side with the investor. So it's this interesting dynamic. By doing this bifurcated structure, the investor is happier and the developer is happier. That's a win-win. Doesn't always happen, but it is a real advantage to this structure. And then overall, compliance is easier too. It's easier on the regulating agency to be able to do the compliance here. So this is tiny print. This is a specific example of how recycling works in a mixed income project, and you would need to kind of check with your tax counsel on whether they totally agree with our approach. But basically, what this is showing is that there's a certain amount of volume cap that is needed for the project, and then there's a certain amount of recycling that can be used on the project and is eligible then. And that's sort of this is where the mixed income kind of hits the road. This is a particularly, has a relatively small amount of low-income units. If it were more, then this becomes an easier calculation. But anyway, this sort of kind of walks through the different tools. But in essence, this is focusing on the low-income component. It's just getting 10% of the financing, or a little bit less than that in this instance. and then the recycling is getting almost 45% of the project. So you can't finance all of it with recycling. There are limits to that in this sort of blended situation, but you can get a lot of the financing done using recycled bonds. And as I said, this is complicated again, and we're using real numbers just to give you an example of it. But in the end, it will always depend on the tax opinion that's going to be reviewed by the issuer's tax counsel and then the borrower's counsel as well. Some more pictures and case studies. So this is a mixed income project that opened this year that had a combination of different units. And once again, we used a bifurcated model as well as a certain amount of recycling. Because this project had more units that were of low income, the recycling itself is relatively small, and the bifurcation is relatively small. This was, once again, before income averaging was put into law, so we were really dealing with a variety of different income levels with this project. And then here we have the sources and uses. And you see a lot of subsidy. You see a rather large first mortgage that gets paid down. So this project both used recycling and created more recycling. It used recycling, which was helpful because we didn't have to fund it all, but it also, because it had so many low-income units in it, it was going to pay down. So you see that in that this project had $45 million in tax credit equity coming in. Let me say, how many units is this whole development? 305. So the total development costs, this is almost $500,000 a unit, so inexpensive development. But you see a lot of subsidy from both the city as well as HDC. You see a really big tax credit element, and then this was a mixed income, so you weren't getting tax credits on all of the units. So even still, it was providing more than 25% of the total development cost, but it was only half low income. So kind of showing how this all works together is sort of kind of cool. Once again, if you're a wonk. Excuse me. Yeah, okay. Another case study, this is another project that opened this year in Flushing in Queens. Similar, it's a lot of very similar, major similarities. Once again, serving a very low income population and a middle income population. The different income bands that were being addressed, you sort of see in the left-hand corner. And this is a total of 230 units. Once again, about $500,000 a unit in total cost. Once again, also a used recycling and then created more recycling. And once again, you see the mixing of the different units as a way to get things done. I just wanted to bring up a little bit about our public housing. If you read anything about New York housing, you know that our public housing is both a very large portion of our overall housing stock, but one that is significantly troubled and really challenged. And part of what we've been tasked with is to work with our housing authority to access capital to try to significantly improve the quality there. Because of the size and scale of our public housing, and just to give you a sense of it, there's 178,000 units initially. It's a lot. It's housing for 500,000 people. And it would dwarf all of our other housing programs if we were to use volume cap for this. What we are doing instead is doing a lending program using recycled bonds and taxable bonds and monies from the city as well as federal resources to be able to turn around this portfolio. It's a super important thing for us to be involved in, and something that we're excited about as well as scared a lot. That's a really daunting program, but we're involved in that, and recycling is an important tool. And this is sort of describing a little bit. We're going out with our next transaction, which is the first one under our new resolution that will happen in January. And so this is sort of new next what we're focusing on of how we're going to use our resources. So this kind of goes into a little bit about that and some interesting structural things from the bond perspective that we're trying to do to use these resources once again as efficiently as possible. So this is basically our recycling story, and one of figuring out ways to both finance the agency itself as well as finance projects, to make an efficient use of volume cap, allowing us to focus on low-income units, while also being able to do moderate and middle-income finance as well. So that is our basic thing. We've been doing this actively. Part of the importance of this is to both gauge the pipeline of potential uses as well as the sources. So there's the sources, the prepayments that will occur, and then the uses, and figuring out how to work them out together. And then obviously the federal law improvements that we're seeking will help, we think, make it be more effective. And in particular in a state like California, where single family is an important part of your landscape, being able to both support both missions and to allow for that kind of crossing, we think is tremendously important. And that, once again, allows as much of the new money to be used for multifamily housing, because it's so effective and gets the biggest bang for the buck. So that's my presentation. I can continue talking about anything, but I want to make sure that people have an opportunity to ask me questions, and Tinru can do that as well.
Before we kick it off, how come so few states have used this? How would you suggest we start?
Well, I think where it's this challenges of recycling is sort of the big point, and that's sort of why it's not easy. There's time frames that need to be managed, and you need to have you need to have a place to put it. So you need to figure out there are costs involved in recycling. So on some level, we've been willing to do it because there's a value created there, but there are costs, and that's part of the dynamic. And you need to coordinate. So in a place that's more fractured, where there are multiple issuers, this requires a coordination. In New York, you really have two major issuers. It's rather easy for us to coordinate, and a lot of the recycling that we've used is our own. So we created our own program, and then we made it as effective and efficient as we could. So that was an advantage that we had. Other places, they'd have to have. It's a mix of, you need the supply and you need the demand. You need to sort of see the efficiency. And let's be clear, over the last 10 years, many places had housing challenges. They didn't necessarily have effective multifamily programs. Multifamily is limited to places that are generally higher cost. Other places, people buy homes, and that's great. In higher cost places, that becomes harder. And so rental housing plays a bigger role. Not every place is as engaged in supporting multifamily housing as our higher cost places are. New York puts an enormous amount of resources into, especially New York City, puts an enormous amount of resources and capital into producing new affordable housing. If you don't have that, it used to be the federal government was a source for some of this. The federal resources have become so restricted and so limited, the home program, CDBG, that there isn't that soft money coming from the federal government. So then you have to go into your own budget. And from the state perspective, and I know that that your state has made an enormous commitment to housing, but you also have a really big state. So it is sort of, and housing in the end is local, right? It's a tricky dynamic. One of the advantages that we have is that it's a big city, but it's one place. And so we can commit those resources, and our mayors, and this is mayors over time, have consistently committed significant capital resources to housing. And so that has led to that. And so all of these different things work together. And there are no accidents. Our approach is a rather centralized approach. We act as an issuer. We're a source of subsidy. So demand comes to us. California, really dispersed. We're highly profitable. We make profit in ways that banks would be pretty. We compete with the banks, or actually they try to compete with us. We don't compete with anyone. But, that's part of the dynamic. As I like to say, when the banks put in subsidy the way we do, then I'm willing to lose to them. But if we're going to put that many resources into affordable housing, then I think it's important from our perspective for us to control a lot of the debt and a lot of the program, because otherwise our resources get leached out and the banks make a lot of money on it. And I don't have a problem with banks making money in affordable housing. I mean, there are a lot of different players here, and they all kind of make their piece, and that's part of economic development too. And I get that, but where they're not taking risk, and yet they're arguably taking risk, but not significant risk in our minds, we feel that it's mispriced. And that's why we've taken a pretty aggressive role in doing that, because affordable housing works. I mean, we have a long history, and even during the financial crisis, affordable housing had very low problems compared to other forms of housing. And we've really been able to manage that. So that's a long answer, but a lot of different things.
That's very helpful. So with that, I'll open it up to other board members. Anyone want to kick it off? Melinda here.
Hi. On the timing piece, when you were talking about you would have preferred 1 year rather than the 6 months, can you go into what do you think would happen if you really had the 1 year, and then why 6 months was the ultimate decision?
You never know why folks, when you're dealing with legislation, and I was directly negotiating with Senator Schumer's staff, who were negotiating with the people who were writing the bill at the time. And they sort of said, well, we want to be it this way. Can you make that work? And the answer, when you're asked that, when you have a choice between yes or no, the answer is yes. Of course we can make that work. And we did. But why? I don't know. It seemed to me kind of silly. I think on some level, sometimes they don't want to make things easy because there's a cost. What we've proven is that the cost of this program is not very expensive, and it has a real value. And that's the other thing. There's this, how do you prove out value? So if we had a longer period of time, for us, we have recycled almost every dollar that we could, but not every dollar. So there's been a little bit of leakage, not significant, but a little bit. We had to be super creative and super responsive, and it sometimes pushed us pretty far. We got it done, but I would say that we're an unusual player. We're super big. We're very strong. We have an enormous amount of demand, and we're very centralized in that sense. And so we had advantages, and that speaks to part of the reason why other people have not been able to use the program as effectively. And so that may have been the desire of Congress, but it's not helpful.
I was just going to thank you all for coming today. I think the other thing that you all have is you have a huge amount of soft financing
Yes.
as well,
Yes.
which I think is something that we would need to think about here.
Also, not all states are bond constrained. They're not all using their volume cap. So this would only work, or you would be motivated to do it if your bond volume cap was constrained and you were.
Right, and that's a great point too. That for many years, volume cap would actually be burnt off. So there's this concept of a carry forward that's permitted with volume cap, but there were states that were just not, and even today there are states that are not using all their volume cap. One of the concepts that we've had is, we said, one, let's increase the amount of volume cap. That makes makes a lot of problems go away, but it has a cost. We've also came up with the idea of a reallocation pool. Maybe if Montana's not using its volume cap, we can access that. And the problem is Montana feels like it lost something. Now, it goes away anyway. So I don't know why they care, but they still feel like they lost something, and that's real, right? People, whatever people feel, it's real. It's real for them, and you have to accept that. So we've tried to come up with different tools, and the idea of an auction, whatever. It's hard. And so, but you're right. Not everyone has the problem, and so if you don't have the problem, it's irrelevant. If you have the problem, then you try to figure out how to solve it.
So that leads us into one of the reasons why we were having this briefing. As the state of California is looking forward, and we look to see that we're going to be volume constrained, and as we go competitive, we heard from the stakeholders, we heard from other issuers, how are we going to help to resolve this problem? And so that was one of the reasons why we wanted to bring Rich here to help educate all of the issuers in the state of California how this might work and what this looks like. And so that's exactly why we're having this briefing.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. All right. First, I want to thank CalHFA for hosting this. And CIDLAC. And for you being here. It was a very informative presentation. We first started talking about bond recycling about 4 or 5 years ago. And it didn't go anywhere because we were carrying forward about $1 billion in cap every year. So it just never became a priority. And fast forward, we're all behind the 8 ball right now. We went from having all this extra allocation to being significantly oversubscribed next year. You raised one of the unique components to California is that many of the large cities are issuers. There's 2 joint powers authorities that issue a very significant amount of multifamily bonds, the state, and so how do we transfer allocation? You mentioned that you can transfer recycled bonds with the state. Can you describe legally how you do that?
I'm not going to go into too much detail about the legal because I don't think it's that helpful, but in essence you can. So basically in essence the prepayment gets moved over to the user. So the original issuer needs to transfer to the new issuer, and there's a process for that, and it's actually it's not that hard. But you need to do it, and you need to do it in a timely manner. So that way, the new issuer, in essence, has to be able to access capital to this, because the prepayment comes in, and then in essence gets shifted over to the new party, and the new party has to pay off the old bonds with other money. So it's sort of a little bit of a, you got to move the money. It's doable. It requires an access to capital, and that access to capital is often tied to an end use. So but you can do an interim that solves for that, and that's so it is complicated. It's not that hard, and it's technical, and to be honest, I'm a little bit removed from the technicalities now, but it really is very much manageable, and there isn't significant financial risk in doing that. The original issuer has no risk at all. The new issuer doesn't have significant risk because they're actually getting they're getting money that they then invest. So it's just the cost of that new money versus the investment. Because it's short, they tend to kind of overlap, and there's not a lot of financial risk in that. But that's what it requires.
Okay, I have a couple more questions, if you don't mind. We've had some conversations with Washington and Massachusetts.
Yeah.
I'm a little less familiar with Colorado. They all use an outside credit facility provider. Yeah. I know Microsoft provides in Washington. I believe Wells Fargo provides for Colorado, and Chase for Massachusetts. Do you
We do it ourselves.
I'm assuming that was your answer, but
But we do have outside facilities, and we have worked with B of A and Citibank as well. The bank, if we had a liquidity issue, we could do that. But we've also done a bond issuance called the convertible option bond that allows us to basically pay off the old bonds with the new bond issuance and then move the prepayment over. So there are different ways to do this, and there are different lines and stuff like that. There's sometimes a cost to that capital versus what you invest at, and if you do it right, it's de minimis.
Right, I imagine that the rate of return on the investment proceeds would be similar to a short-term
Exactly.
cash collateralized
Right,
bond
exactly. Right,
now.
exactly.
Okay, I'm sure others have questions. One more. These mixed income projects are great, and we have a few in California, but the vast majority of our volume cap goes to 100% affordable projects.
Great.
Where all of the units are reserved at either 50% or 60%
Uh-huh.
AMI. And so how do you use recycled cap for 100% affordable projects, and if so, how do you spread that around?
Well, you would only do that if the project, it depends on how much debt the project can support. So generally, low-income projects don't support that much debt. So it doesn't make sense to give them recycling when, basically, if they're going from 50 million in bonds down to 10 million, recycling doesn't provide any help. Where in some instances they have a bigger permanent debt, or they have a reasonably large size permanent debt. Like I did give a couple examples of mixed incomes where we did use recycling even though they were doing a pay down. And so you can do that, but there has to be a logic to it. You just don't do it for fun. In that instance, it allows us to recycle more. So there was value in us doing that. And the upfront recycling made sense. In that the project needed more borrowing than the 50% test. That's the other thing. We're really super tight on the 50% test. One of the things I've heard about California, and so I'll make a little plug for efficiency, is you allow people to fund at 60%. It's ridiculous.
It used to be higher until these new rules went in.
They will go with 52%. It is fine. There's not a lot of risk there. But if you are financing 60% of the project during construction, then that any amount above 52% can be done with recycling. And that's where you would do it on a low-income project. So if you need to fund more during construction because other sources are coming in later, you can get better pricing on tax credits the longer you the least amount of time that you allow it to be coming in later in the project. So you'll get a better price for that, but you then have to finance it, and then there's a balance of the different costs. But that's part of the dynamic that goes on.
Last quick question. You mentioned the pending legislation. We were disappointed to see exempt facilities removed from that.
Yeah.
That would have been a really helpful use in California because waste management and other projects
That was
here,
my idea.
They take.
I
and
agree.
I know, Washington. They were really disappointed too. Do you know why?
Yeah,
why that's even controversial?
it was it's a misunderstanding, and sometimes, once again, it goes back to how legislation happens. You want it to be only smart people making the decisions, and they get it, and you decide, and you have an understanding, and we all get it, and we move forward. It's not always that people have disagreements, and sometimes in order to cut things short, in order to end things, you sort of have to kind of agree, all right, well, we're not going to agree about that. And that's what happened with that, but that doesn't mean that it can't be rethought. Similarly, it's not set up to deal with mortgage certificates, and that's one of the things that's one of your big uses here in the state. If it had been raised while we were dealing with things, then we probably could have addressed it, and it probably still can be addressed, but no one brought it up. And once again, sometimes we're pretty efficient and effective ourselves, and we are good at dealing with legislation, and we it takes, because everyone has their own little world, right? We have to deal with our own local politics, and then to worry about federal politics is just it's more work. And so we've taken on certain aspects of that because because one, we had the greatest need, and we were able to articulate that. So we've owned this recycling as an issue for a long time. And so we start with that, but other people have their needs and stuff, and we're a coalition player. We're part of a big team, and so we're happy to do that. But no one raised it, and then it got raised literally this past week because of Francesc. And that's all good, but if it had been raised 6 months ago, we probably could have addressed it. It still can be. It hasn't passed, so you can always play with it. But it's that dynamic, and Washington is, D.C. is hard, and getting legislation done is super hard, and you have to play the long game always.
Great, thank you.
Well, sure.
Well, I will.
Okay, there you go. Hi, Felicity Wood, Finance Specialist here at CalHFA. I'm pretty sure you're in a room full of wonks, so thank you. I just want to ask a couple practical questions so I am understanding this high level. Recycled bonds won't get you tax credits,
Correct.
but they can count towards the 50% test.
No.
Okay.
No, they don't.
Okay.
So you still, what I was saying is in a mixed income project, and I gave an example that's, once again, super complicated, is you can use recycled bonds on the moderate or market rate component. So that's the good news, is that you can. There's an allocation that can be done so that you can fund a certain, you're not just funding the low income component with tax exempt bonds, and part of that would be new money and part of it would be recycled. You can also fund part of the moderate or middle income component with bonds as well. And that can count.
Got it.
And so that's just the good news.
Okay, thank you. And then my other clarifying question, the state allocating agency is not involved in the recycling, is that correct?
Well, we don't have a state allocating agency the way you do. So what happens is the state itself allocates through the Department of Budget, and so once bonds are allocated, they just go out. So we don't have anything that's really comparable. And
Do
so
the recycled bonds have to go through the Department of Budget again?
no,
Okay.
no. Once the issuer has it, they can deal directly. So when it's the state HFA, they deal directly with us, and we deal directly with them.
Okay.
If we were to get the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act provisions, and if we had broader provisions, that is IDAs and the like, which currently it's not in the bill, but if it were to be in the bill, we probably would need to have some interface because we don't have those relationships. So it probably would go back to the state in that instance. They would have to be playing that role of creating the relationships. So in all likelihood, what I can imagine, and probably something that you might try to do here because of all the different issuers, is someone has to act as a coordinator to sort of receive information about prepayments and then also get the requests for the usage. So what I would imagine is that if the state had IDA needs that were going to be met with recycling, they would have to act as that interplay, because we're not set up to, I don't know who's in, Erie County, which is Buffalo, in New York, and I don't have the relationship with the IDA there, but if the state said, we're not going to give you a new volume cap unless you transfer 30 million of your recycling to Erie County, I go, okay. It's leverage. Their leverage is they allocate to us. But they also then need to tell us Erie County needs it and when they need it, and then we would say this is when we think we'll have it. So there's a coordination that needs to happen in order for things to be efficient. And because right now it's just us and the state HFA, we talk to each other and we can be pretty efficient. If you started doing it more broadly and you have 65 counties, or I don't know how many counties that California has, but whatever, the various counties, and Kern County, I know county, Kern County, was going to get needed a certain amount. and it was coming from San Francisco through CalHFA, someone would need to have to do that coordinating.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
I have a quick question. A lot of the presentation speaks to, getting it done. or
Yeah.
Getting through acquisition, and through stabilization. Post stabilization, are there any unique servicing requirements that are aligned with this program?
The biggest issue is that you can't have debt going out. You can't have bonds outstanding longer than the 34 years from the original issuance. So you have to kind of track that. So if you're using recycling, it's an interesting issue. We're dealing with it on that public housing deal. The bonds the recycling we're using goes out to 2050. And the deal itself got delayed a little bit, so it's going to close in 2020 and in January. And we were running up against a problem with some of the recycling. So we've actually had to pull in because there's a balloon there, and we had to pull in the maturity by a month. And that's sort of tracking. That you have to pay attention to, because that is sort of the tricky thing. So things like that.
So do you have a segregated department that just does that?
It's tin room. No,
And here she is.
There's a reason why she's here. She makes me look good. She's great and super smart. No, we do tracking, and so and we have capital markets, and we have our accounting department. We have different folks, and so yeah, you need to keep track of that as part of that. We're in the so actually, why don't you talk a little bit about the process of the process? The big spreadsheet and all of that.
Sure. So while we don't have that tracking spreadsheet on the screen, but basically, I think it was Felicity, right? Asked about the kind of whether there is a kind of a centralized agency to coordinate and track. The answer here is no, but in some way, so Rich and our president, they have direct conversation with state HFA to get a sense of timing-wise, volume-wise, pipeline-wise, what is the sources and the uses, and then we sort of implement a tracking sheet to track how much we are how much of needs at what timing, and so this is the uses side, and on the sources side, how much are we going to receive from our own pipeline? And in addition to that, as Rich mentioned, to address the huge recycle needs on addressing the public housing, we also started working with the state HFA to receive their prepayments. So we started having a huge Excel spreadsheet tracking all the sources and uses and the timing. And eventually, I would say, I actually started with HDC back in 2008. This is Recycle program happens to be also my first program. And I would say there is a ramp-up period when, in the beginning, our observation is you actually have 2/3 of your recycle amount pending on those interim financing. So you haven't really figured out a way to perfectly line up your sources and uses. So you need to create a facility to basically preserve that recycle amount. But over time, we have been able to shift from 2/3 relying on that facility to 2/3 doing a so-called direct allocation. And that also goes back to, I think, John, you asked a question about how we do the allocation with the state. Not going to the too technical part, but our bond council sort of see as long as there is no, you could have different issuing entity to recycle the prepayments. So, for example, state HFA, they have prepayments that they cannot recycle for their own because they don't have enough uses. They could allocate to us with HDC issuing refunding bonds to recycle their prepayments. So it's really just a bonding authority to kind of continuing on that tax exempt authority. The reason I'm here is this is the richest mastermind behind all of this. But since we understand it takes a lot of time, a lot of the joint effort to ramp up this program. So if you have any question, especially like technically how to really started this program and track all of these, feel free to reach out.
Actually, one follow-up question on that. Do all of your documents contemplate bond recycling so that every pay down goes back to the issuer? Because you mentioned the state HFA.
Right. Ours always are coming back to us. So even when we do what's called a back-to-back funding agreement with one of the banks, and Citibank is very active doing that, what we built in was a time frame that allowed us to recycle. So prepayment occurs, they have to hold on to it up to 45 days. So that we can arrange a financing. So if we are doing a direct allocation because the time frames work, we'll just get it back from them. If not, we'll do what's called the convertible option bond, and we'll basically issue a refunding bond to pay them off. But other than that, most of the loans are our loans, so they have to come back to us. So it's built in the structure. The state is similar in that either they have a back-to-back or it's going back to them. So it's relatively straightforward between the two of us. So it's not as complicated. It depends, once again, here, whatever structures were agreed to originally, it's, I think, trickier, and maybe going forward, it's one of the things that I guess CIDLAC could do is require certain things that would facilitate that. So that's part of the coordination that would need to happen, because it's tricky. And as I said, for us, it's a little bit easier because we're really are, such a prominent part of overall.
Yeah, most multifamily projects in California have a private placement lender.
Yep.
They often don't have a trustee or even a fiscal agent, and so those pay downs they're extinguishing the
Yep.
allocation today. So we would need a mechanism so that the pay down does not extinguish the allocation.
Correct.
You mentioned that so they serve as the fiscal agent and will not technically receive those pay down funds in case you want to reuse them?
So
I'm asking some of these questions for bond counsel in the last row.
So this goes back to as long as you have a good tracking system, this could certainly facilitate that. Part of that is you sort of you will need to know, okay, this is the direct placement transaction that you have last control over the timing and who's the direct purchaser, so that you build into a notice period to force you give them a time frame to prepay within that 4 year, because it's part of your program. And so the same message out to all the borrower that they could benefit from the recycled amount for their future deal. So they are very incentivized to, comply with that 4 year period. So you have a tickler in your own system, knowing that you project out how many direct placement deal they should be sending in the prepayments within this time frame. You monitor the status of the construction, and sort of check on them when they are getting close to that conversion date, and they request them to send a notice to you and request them to keep feeding the bond, which is that direct place bond with the bank, so that you have a little bit time, which we usually force them to sort of give us 45 days period for you to arrange a refunding bond and be able to recycle those. So
Right.
part of the entire system.
I mean, it is sort of like, for us, prepayments don't just happen. There's an expectation. It's in essence a mini closing again. So you tend to know about when they're going to happen, and then once again, you can structure it so that the prepayment covers interest for the period for the next 30 days or 45 days, and that's what we require. So even when people prepay us, we require them to pay an additional 2 months. So it's just part of what we do. It covers part of the time frames that it takes to call bonds and the like. So it's a similar kind of concept. But yeah, you would need to build it into the loan structure. But it's doable, and people have done it. So
One follow-up unrelated question. Do you provide incentives to projects that use recycled cap? You've been in a competitive environment. We're going into that right now. We're going to be, CIDLAC, our allocating committee, is going to be revamping the regulations probably for 2021. Do you provide, if a project is willing to take a recycled cap, does that enhance their scoring or?
Well, on some level, we have a pipeline that is much greater than what we can actually finance. So there are incentives built into that, which is, well, if you want an allocation of volume cap, you might get that in 2022, or if you're willing to do it with just recycling and a little bit more subsidy, we'll do it in 6 months. So with the incentive there, I mean, it is sort of built into that. It's priorities, and that's part of that. And so mixed income projects. Here's the thing, say it's a 150 unit building or a 120 unit building, relatively small for us in New York, and it was only going to be 20% low income. So let's say let's say it's 125 units. That's only 25 low income units. It's hard to sell tax credits on something that small on a mixed income project. They're better off on some level if we did recycling or even a taxable deal there and providing subsidy. So in certain instances, that's what we do. So and that's part of the overall prioritization. Our process is a little bit more managed, not quite as public as the allocating committee. So that's a different dynamic. But you would factor that into your scoring, which is that if the pricing is weak, because it's a relatively small low-income component, that you should then, that you would be better off. I mean, that's what you need to do, is sort of how do you prioritize? It's all about efficiency again. It's definitely the word for today.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Do we have the ability for folks on the phone to ask questions? No? Okay. Was there anybody else in the audience that had a question? Any more board members with questions?
Hey, Tony, no questions. What's that?
No, I'm surprised.
I'm good.
Are you good? Yeah. Okay. Well, we thank you tremendously.
Thank you. Okay.
So I want to thank all of the audience, and I hope they did get something out of this. It really is going to take coordination, as we have heard from the governor. This is an all-of-the-above approach, and to the extent that we can all work together to make sure that we're conserving the precious resources that we have in the state of California, I'm looking forward to working with the stakeholders and the partners as we continue to deliberate this and have conversations. So thank you all very much.
Right, and
Rich?
the PowerPoint has our contacts. So if there are questions, you either want to factor them through CalHFA or you can deal directly with Tim Rue and me. That's great.
I believe all of this is going to be posted on both CIDLAC and CIDLAC and CalHFA's website as well.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.